There's a specific kind of hurt that doesn't behave like other hurts. It doesn't fade the way a clean rejection fades. It loops. It comes back at 3 a.m. It comes back when you see their name in a notification from something completely unrelated. It comes back in the middle of a normal Tuesday, when you weren't even thinking about them. And the strangest part isn't the pain. It's that you can't explain why it's this big. They weren't even that important, maybe. It was 4 dates, or 2 months, or a conversation that had just started to feel like something real. And yet the hurt is outsized in a way you can't justify, even to yourself. If you've been sitting with that confusion, the pain you can't quite defend, this video is going to give you the explanation you didn't find anywhere else. Not the version that tells you to move on. The version that tells you exactly what's happening inside your brain and why your reaction makes complete sense. Most conversations about ghosting skip past the part that actually does the damage. They go straight to why people do it. Avoidant attachment, fear of confrontation, the disposability of dating apps. And those things are real, but they don't touch what's happening on your end. Specifically, they don't touch this. Ghosting is not just rejection. It's rejection without the dignity of an ending. There is a particular kind of humiliation that comes with that distinction, and it's different from the humiliation of being told no. When someone ends things, even badly, even unkindly, there is a shape to it. There is a before and an after. Your brain knows how to begin processing a thing that has a clear edge. Ghosting has no edge. There's just the slow, disorienting realization that something you thought was alive has quietly stopped, and you were the last to know, and you may never know why. And what happens next is the part that nobody describes accurately. You don't grieve. Exactly. Grief has a shape too. What you do instead is stay in a kind of suspended waiting, not fully believing it's over because it was never declared over. Part of you keeps the file open. Part of you is still listening for a sound that isn't coming. There's actually a clinical name for this kind of loss. Psychologist Pauline Boss coined the term ambiguous loss, describing a situation where something is gone but not finished, where the ending is unclear enough that the mind cannot fully process it as an ending. Ghosting is almost a textbook case. The person is absent, but they're still there. On social media, in your contacts, in the same city, choosing actively not to be in contact with you. That combination of absence and presence is not something the brain handles gracefully. It was not designed to. So let's talk about what's actually happening inside your brain when this lands, because this is the part that changes everything about how you understand your own reaction. When researchers at UCLA put people inside fMRI machines and studied what happens in the brain during social rejection, they found something that genuinely surprised the scientific community. The brain regions that activate during social rejection are the same regions that activate during physical pain. Not similar regions, the same ones. The anterior cingulate cortex, a structure involved in processing the experience of physical hurt, responds to being excluded or rejected the way it responds to being injured. This is not a metaphor. The pain is real, it is measurable, it is neurobiological. So when the hurt from ghosting feels physical, when there's something in your chest, something in your stomach, that is not you being dramatic, that is your brain running the same circuitry it would run if something had actually hurt your body. The language we use when we say "that stings" or "that was a blow" is more accurate than we knew. But here's the part that explains why ghosting specifically hits harder than a clear rejection. A clean rejection, even a painful one, gives the brain a signal it can work with. The pattern is complete. The situation has been categorized. The file can begin to close. Ghosting does not give the brain that signal. What it gives the brain instead is an open loop, an unresolved pattern that the mind keeps returning to, searching for the ending that would allow it to stop searching. Researchers studying what's called the need for cognitive closure describe this drive precisely. The brain has an almost physical need to complete incomplete patterns. When something ends without explanation, that ending stays active in the mind, not as memory, but as an ongoing problem the brain is still trying to solve. Your nervous system treats the unresolved situation not as something that happened, but as something that is still happening. Which is why you keep replaying the last conversation. Which is why you check their profile at 1 a.m., even knowing it won't tell you anything useful. Which is why it surfaces again 3 weeks later when you thought you were over it. You weren't ruminating because something was wrong with you. Your brain was doing exactly what it was built to do. trying to close a loop that was never closed. And there's one more layer to this. When the brain is running a threat response and unresolved social rejection is, neurobiologically, a threat response, cortisol stays elevated. The stress system remains activated. Not because you're choosing to stay upset, because the situation was never categorized as resolved, so the body never received the signal to stand down. This is what people mean when they say they can't stop thinking about it. It isn't weakness. It's a nervous system doing its job in a situation specifically designed to prevent it from completing that job. Now here is the part that does the most damage, and it is the part that nobody talks about clearly enough. When something ends without explanation, the brain doesn't just loop on the question of what happened. It does something more specific and more harmful. In the absence of external information, the brain turns inward, and it answers the question it was asking, why did they leave, with the only data it has ready access to. You. This is not a choice. It is not a character flaw. It is the predictable result of what happens when the brain is trying to close a loop with incomplete information. It fills the gap with a story, and the story it reaches for first, especially if there's any existing anxiety around being worthy of love, is the most available one. Something must be wrong with me. I must have said the wrong thing. I must have wanted too much. I must be the kind of person this keeps happening to. That move from why did they disappear to what does their disappearance say about who I am is the moment the wound deepens past the loss itself. Because the loss of one person is one thing, but a verdict about your fundamental lovability is something else entirely. And ghosting, by design, hands the brain exactly the conditions it needs to reach that verdict on its own. Here is what is actually true. The silence tells you almost nothing accurate about you. Research consistently shows that ghosting is driven primarily by the ghoster's discomfort, their avoidance, their conflict aversion, their inability to tolerate the difficulty of an honest conversation. In one study published in the journal Personal Relationships in 2025, people who were ghosted maintained ongoing emotional attachment to the person who disappeared, even while experiencing the same levels of negative emotion as people who received a clear rejection. Their hearts, in other words, stayed open to someone who had given them no information. That is not pathology. That is what attachment does in the absence of a clear ending. The reaction you had wasn't evidence that you want too much. It wasn't evidence that something about you drives people away. It was evidence that your nervous system, like every human nervous system, responds to unexplained absence as a threat and tries to make meaning out of the silence the only way it can. That is what you learned, not who you are. If what this video has opened is something you want to actually sit with, not just understand but move through, there's a journal in the description built for exactly that. 30 guided prompts across 5 emotional stages, designed specifically for the thoughts that surface late at night, the ones that circle without landing anywhere. Not therapy, not tactics, something you can actually work with in the moment you need it most. It's linked in the description and in the pinned comment. You probably already know the logical version of what comes next. Give it time. Stop checking their profile. Focus on yourself. That advice isn't wrong. It's just not operating at the level where the problem actually lives. Because the loop that ghosting creates isn't a thought problem. It's a nervous system problem. And nervous systems don't respond to being told to stop. So here's what the research actually supports. And it's simpler than most people expect. There's a body of work in neuroscience around what's sometimes called affect labeling. When you name what's happening, not in a journaling prompt therapeutic kind of way, but concretely, specifically, out loud or on paper, you activate the prefrontal cortex in a way that measurably reduces activity in the amygdala. You interrupt the threat response, just slightly, just enough, by naming what the threat response is doing. In practice, this looks less like processing and more like this. Instead of following the spiral, the replaying, the checking, the composing and deleting, you pause for long enough to name what's actually happening. Not, I miss them, more like, my brain is trying to close a loop right now, it doesn't have enough information to close it, so it's generating a story about me to fill the gap. That story is not accurate. It's what brains do. That is not a magic fix. It is not going to dissolve the pain in a single moment. What it does, and what the evidence supports, is interrupt the automatic move from unanswered question to verdict about my worth. It creates a small gap between the trigger and the story the brain tells about the trigger. And that gap is not nothing. That gap is actually where everything starts. One more thing worth saying honestly. Understanding why this happens will not stop it from happening. The next time someone goes quiet without explanation, the nervous system will still respond the way it responds. The loop will still open. The inward turn will still come. That is not a failure of this video or of your effort. That is how nervous systems work. They don't update on the basis of new information alone. What updates them is different kinds of repeated experience over time. What this video gave you is not a solution, it's the accurate map. And the accurate map, knowing what's actually happening in your body when the silence arrives, knowing that the story the brain reaches for is a biological default and not a truth, that map changes what's available to you in the moment. You can't always stop the loop, but you can stop mistaking the loop for evidence. If this opens something you want to go deeper on, the resource in the description was built for exactly this kind of night. It's linked in the description and the pinned comment, and it'll show you where to go next. When the loop starts, the replaying, the checking, the 3 a.m. spiral, what does your brain usually land on first? The question of what happened, or the story about what it means about you. There's something worth naming before this ends. The question most people arrive at this video carrying, even if they wouldn't put it in these words, is something like, why does this keep doing this to me? Why does the silence of one person I barely knew send me into something this large? And underneath that question is usually a quieter one, the one that doesn't get asked out loud. What does it say about me that I respond this way? Here is what the evidence actually shows, not the reassuring version. The structural one. Your brain is running hardware that was built long before dating apps, before smartphones, before the particular cruelty of a person who is technically present and choosing to be absent. That hardware evolved to treat unexplained social withdrawal as a serious threat, because for most of human history, it was. Being excluded, being abandoned, being disappeared from, these were not emotional inconveniences. They were survival events. And the brain that kept you alert to them, that refused to categorize the unresolved as resolved, that turned inward to find out what it could do differently next time, that brain was protecting you. The problem is not the hardware. The problem is that the hardware was not updated for a world where someone can disappear by simply not pressing a button, where the silence is chosen rather than circumstantial, where the brain runs a survival-level response to something that, in the cold logic of the present moment, is one person's inability to have an uncomfortable conversation. Your reaction was not disproportionate. It was precisely proportionate to what your nervous system was designed to do with exactly this kind of information. What you walked into this video believing, maybe, was that the intensity of your reaction was evidence of something broken. What the evidence actually shows is that it was evidence of something working exactly as designed, in a situation that the design never accounted for. Those are two completely different things. One is a verdict, one is a biology. And a biology, unlike a verdict, is something you can understand, something you can learn to work with, something that, given time and different kinds of experience, can learn something new. That is not the same as telling you it gets easier. It's something more specific than that. It's telling you that what happened in your brain when they went quiet was not a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of what you learned, a long time ago probably, about what silence from someone who was supposed to be there means. That is what you learned, not who you are.